It's now April 7, 2020. Let's get started with today's class. Today's class is about fiat currency and about floating currency. Fiat currency means money that was made out of thin air. For example, when the Federal Reserve makes a loan to the US Treasury, they just write a number in a ledger, a digital ledger, say $1 trillion, and the money came into existence out of nothing. That's fiat currency. The Federal Reserve doesn't need to do anything. For example, buy gold or precious metals or land. They just write the number and the money exists. Floating currency is similar. It's a reference to the fact that when you have fiat currency that is not connected to anything in the physical world, the price of that currency compared to some currency in some other country can go up and down a lot. So let me share the screen and see some of where we were last time. Let me first give you a couple of comments about the news. CNBC, this is from yesterday, coronavirus mortgage bailout. There's going to be complete chaos, says industry CEO. So what this means is that the mortgage industry is freaked out because since many people have been told they don't have to pay their mortgages right now for 1 or 2 or 3 months, then unfortunately the bill that was approved by Congress doesn't do anything about the fact that the companies that service the mortgage, that is the companies that actually communicate with the debtor and track payments, etc. Those companies that service the mortgage still have to pay the bondholders that are supposed to get money from those mortgages. So for example, if we have a collateralized debt obligation, that means there are holders of that, of those bundles of mortgages that have to receive payments. Now the mortgage industry has to make those payments, even though it's not getting money from the consumers, the people who have the mortgages. So they're freaking out. They're extremely upset. They claim that it's going to be a major disaster. So meanwhile, here's another thing that's pretty dramatic. Oil prices from 2015 to 2019, as you can see here in the bottom, oil prices have hovered around $50 a barrel. A barrel includes 42 gallons, which includes around 20 gallons that become gasoline, maybe 10 or 11 gallons that become diesel fuel, and about 4 gallons that become jet fuel. So that's in there, and that used to sell for, sometimes $100 a barrel, sometimes $50 or $60 a barrel. If you look here in Canada, one of the major manufacturers of barrels, Western Canadian Select, in April 1st, April Fool's Day, each barrel was at $4.91. Similarly, in March 30, 2020, Western Canadian Select crude oil was at $3.82 per barrel. This is incredible. This is just devastating and threatening for the oil industry. If it becomes so cheap, many vendors of oil that need higher prices in order to continue existing are in danger of collapsing, of ceasing to exist. So this is some of the background of what's going on in our floating currency system in the age of the coronavirus. But now let's look at the topics for today's class. We had looked last time at the adjusted monetary base, the sum of all currency ever created by the Federal Reserve. in this chart represented by this extraordinary spiking curve. Somebody asked me, by the way, why did the price of oil fall? And the answer is just that mainly there's this conflict going on between OPEC and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia decided to reduce their prices. Other sellers therefore reduced their prices too. And at the same time, very few people are buying oil because most airplane travel is being canceled. Few people are driving on the roads. Trucks and supply chains had stopped. So if people are not interested in buying oil, the price goes down. Can we buy gallons of crude now to sell later? Asked Charles. You could, of course, but let me not get into that now. What matters for a moment is we have this enormous creation of money. This is fiat currency, meaning this money came out of nowhere and now exists, and far much more money exists and is in the American system. So the question becomes, when are we going to get inflation? Since so much money was created in 2008 and the following years, when is that money going to hit the market so that we start seeing higher prices in everything? For example, you see the price of oil, and what you see are lower prices. Not just now, but prices for many things have been going down for the past several years. Derivatives, as I've said before, are bets that we make about future financial developments. For example, there are speculations about future prices, whether it's a future price of oil or the future price of dollars in terms of euros, etc. We can make bets about these future prices, and they're called derivatives. When did this market of speculation begin? This is part of the topic of today's class. So, as I've said before, in 1971, President Nixon ends the gold standard. The gold standard had been successful in giving a fixed value to the US dollar for over 100 years. So, for example, from 1841 or thereabout until 1932, the dollar price for 1 ounce of gold was almost constantly $20.67. This is 1841 until 1932. So that's almost 100 years, the same price for 1 ounce of gold. It fluctuated a little bit once in a while because of war, but when there wasn't a war, then it was pretty much fixed. 1933 until 1970, the price of 1 ounce of gold in the United States is also pretty stable. It's around $35. Sometimes it goes up to say up to $43, but again, having to do with major anomalies in the international world. So we've got these price controls. Nixon removes it by saying we are no longer going to redeem US dollars for gold. If you have US dollars in your foreign country and you want to come to the US and trade them for gold, you're out of luck. We're not going to give you the gold. We're going to break our promise. You're not getting any gold. This is an inflationary move. This puts in danger the value of the US currency because people who have dollars can realize, boy, I've been lied to. I thought I could get gold, real something, in exchange for these paper bills, and now they realize they can't get it. So if they do that, the exchange rates for dollars and other currencies can change a lot. Nixon tries to stop that. As president, someone has enormous latitude to decide what's going to be the prices of certain services, what's going to be the fees that are going to be paid, taxes, all kinds of restrictions so that you can try to control the value of the currency. This is 1971. At that time, there is an interesting development happening at the so-called Chicago Mercantile Group, an exchange trading platform located in Chicago that ever since 1898 was used for trading commodities and making bets about future prices. So for example, if you want to sell eggs or you want to sell bacon and you are worried that in the future you're going to have some fluctuations in the supply chain, or there's going to be weather events that are going to create a problem in the supply chain, then you want to be able to sell your eggs at a fixed price so that you make a profit. So just as the price of your eggs can go down, it can also go up because of events. For example, weather, there's a lack of eggs, so the price of eggs can go up. So both sellers and buyers want to buy eggs at a fixed price so that they can get a fair deal that ensures that their business doesn't suffer from sudden shocks. So the Chicago Mercantile Exchange is handling these kind of trading of commodities like butter, eggs, bacon, etc. And these agreements to sell and buy at fixed prices are known as futures contracts. You buy at a set price. So if you're a buyer, you have what is known as a long position. Essentially, you're betting that the price of these commodities is going to go up. So you want to fix the price that we have right now so that in the future, you're going to be buying them relatively cheaper to the price that they're going to have. If you're a seller, you're assuming that these prices might go down. So you want to fix your price. You want to fix your price and make your sale price now so that if the price go down, you still get a good present sale price. Again, this is to mitigate risk of price changes. By 1960, the Merc is dying. There are fewer and fewer traders. Many of these price fluctuations have been controlled by things such as indoor farming. For example, if you have your chickens, your hens in a covered area, then they're not as susceptible to being affected by the weather. So there's a guy there, Leo Melamed, who's in our readings today. Leo Melamed is a trader of pork belly. In other words, he's a trader of bacon. And he sees what Nixon has done, and he realizes that now the US dollar is not going to be a stable currency. Now that it's unpegged from gold, it might fluctuate a lot. If the US dollar fluctuates a lot, then people who are selling goods such as bacon might lose a lot of money. So he thinks, I need some way to stabilize the price of currencies such as the US dollar. In particular, Leo Melamed thinks that the price of the British pound is going to go down. So he wishes that he could place a bet against the price of the British pound. If he could bet against the price of British currency, then when it goes down, he's going to make a lot of money. So he wants to create a futures contract for currencies instead of commodities. He knew that in Chicago, there is this economist called Milton Friedman, who I've mentioned previously. And Milton Friedman is against state intervention in prices and in capitalism. So he decides to enroll Leo Melamed, not enrolled, I think he's just auditing classes by Milton Friedman. And he musters the courage to go meet with Friedman and ask for advice. He wants Friedman to give him an opinion on this idea of futures contracts for money. he tells them, well, I want to create a financial futures market. I want to be able to make bets. I want to be able to make futures contracts on what the future price of currencies will be. So for example, we're going to be able to trade dollars for pounds at a fixed rate, for example, at the present rate, even though we're making that trade a year from now. Milton Friedman hears this idea. He thinks this is just absolutely great. He says, what a wonderful idea. This is great. So Melamed hires Friedman to do some analysis work for him. And this leads Melamed to create the first financial futures market at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And this market becomes known as the International Monetary Market. That is the place where we can make futures contracts on money. Not everybody likes this. David Stockman, who you read maybe last night, thinks this is an awful idea. He thinks this is a doomsday mechanism, and he thinks that this led to the great stock market crash of 1987 that was known as Black Monday. Black Monday 1987, the Dow Jones Industrial Average drops 23%. Whereas in the Great Depression, the greatest one-day drop had been 13%. So Stockman blames this collapse of the stock market and also of the financial futures market. He blames it on these kind of speculative derivatives that were created by pork belly trader Leo Melamed. Melamed has the platform to create this because since 1969, he was chairman of the Merc. David Stockman thinks that basically this is a disaster, what has happened in the financial sector, both because of Nixon and because of Melamed and because of Friedman. He thinks this is a disaster, this is a doomsday mechanism, and he points out that by 1980, says David Stockman rightly, the US dollar has lost 45% of its buying power. What we know of as inflation, the US dollar can only buy half as much as it used to buy in 1970. So in just a 10-year period, the US dollar has lost 45% of its buying power. If you compare the US dollar versus a German currency, the Deutschmarks, then similarly, the US dollar had lost 50% of its value. And not just is that a problem, but it had also gained and lost value abruptly. In a period of time, it's fluctuating a lot compared to the Deutschmarks, which means that in a span of several years, there had been fluctuations in the neighborhood of 400 percentage points. Regardless, before 1980, before these kind of problems are happening in 1980 and 1987, Leo Melamed meets Alan Greenspan, who at the time was President Ford's advisor in the Council of Economic Advisors. So Greenspan is not yet chair of the Federal Reserve, but he's in this Council of Economic Advisors. He meets with Melamed. Melamed tells him his idea. And again, Greenspan thinks this is a wonderful idea. He says, this is a great idea to help stabilize business. So we have these different perspectives on whether the abandoning the gold standard and creating these financial futures markets was good or bad. On the one hand, you've got Melamed, Chicago economists such as Milton Friedman, and future chair of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. They all say this is great, this is wonderful, this is precisely what we need. On the other hand, you've got skeptics such as David Stockman who say this is a monstrous disaster, this is awful. All right, now let's look at some of these images. This is an image by cartoonist John Bayer from the 1920s, 1930s. He wrote for a magazine called Labor Magazine. He would do these cartoons. It's interesting how much this image resembles the present, meaning the government giving a lot of money to different sectors. And here already, John Bayer points out the irony. On the one hand, you've got business people complaining that if you give money to poor people, that's unacceptable, anti-capitalist, and it's socialism. And they say that's awful. The government should never give money to poor people. That's socialism. On the other hand, the same people are getting a ton of money. They're getting grants. They're getting tax abatements. They're getting loans. They're getting interest-free loans. They're getting subsidies, whether it's shipbuildings or farmers, oil industry, aviation. They're getting piles and piles of public money so that they can keep winning. All right. So if we create all this money out of nothing and we give it to the rich, we give it to the business people, what is that going to do to inflation? So you can go online and look up an inflation calculator. And if you input, for example, $1, how much is the inflation on $1 from 1914, which is the year after the Federal Reserve was created, until 2020? You're going to find the calculator tells you the value of $1 changed by 2,487%. So what does that mean? We have to kind of parse it out, and I will in a moment. But for example, if you could have $1 in 1914, $1, and with $1 you can buy a certain amount of food. Suppose that by 1919, 5 years later, you can only buy half as much food. If you can only buy half as much food, then we say that the price of the currency has changed in as much as it has lost 50% of its value. It used to be that you could get a certain amount of food. Now you can only get half as much with this currency. But we'll look at this in a moment. If we divide this inflation, which seems to be the price of commodities, the price of food, the price of real estate is all going up. If we divide that per year, the calculator tells us that annual inflation has been 3.0%. If you look at this, you should be skeptical. It's odd that such a round, beautiful number, after 100 years, more than 100 years, 106 years, the annual inflation is just 3% on average every year. You should be skeptical about this. So I wanted to test this. Is this true? For example, in 2008, as I said, the Federal Reserve starts creating enormous piles of cash and giving it to banks. Did that create inflation? Did that create a lot of inflation? What exactly has happened? So I had to test that. The way you can test that is you have to find the actual price of past goods and compare those past prices. So for example, price from 1914, you have to compare it to a price from 2020. So I did that. Here it is. I found congressional hearings. This is from 1919, as you can see here. Washington, D.C., Government Printing Office, 1919. So this is at around the time of the end of World War I. Hearings in Congress about inflation, meaning it used to be that I could buy a loaf of bread with this amount of money. Now I can buy much less. So here we have actual prices for a number of goods. So for example, it says, look at the chart. it shows that on April 15, 1914, we could buy a dozen eggs for 23.6 cents. 5 years later, the same amount of money bought only 4 eggs. So what this means is, in a 5-year period, the US dollar was losing an enormous chunk of its value because of the war, because of hyperinflation, because of whatever reason you want to give, but the dollar is losing its value. This discussion is accompanied by a graph with different items: sugar, bread, sirloin steak, eggs, and this is what that diagram looks like. Washington, D.C., purchasing price of principal articles of food for April 15, 1914. Now they're going to compare it with purchasing prices about 5 years later. So this is what matters. 27 cents for a pound of sirloin steak. 5 years later, 27 cents bought a little bit more than half a pound. So half of the value of money has vanished. This is what euphemistically is described as inflation. Sugar, 1914, you could get 1 pound of sugar for 4.8 cents. 5 years later, you can get less than half a pound. So again, the value of money is vanishing. This is horrible. This is horrible. Imagine if you have money, you have $10,000 in savings. 5 years later, your $10,000 is worth half as much. If this is happening every year or every 5 years, the value of your savings is tending towards nothing faster than any interest that you can possibly make, whether it's in a bank, in a savings account, or even probably in a money market account or a stock market investment. If we had such huge changes in a 5-year period, how does that compare to over 100 years? And here we go. So I started comparing some of these goods. Here is the evidence from 1914. 9 cents bought you a pound of rice. These are listings from 2020, from just a few days ago. HEB supermarket, long grain, brown rice was $1.41 for 2 pounds. So 1 pound used to be 9 cents more than 100 years ago. Now 1 pound is 70 cents or so. Eggs. It used to be that you could get a dozen eggs in 1914 for 23 cents. There it is. Now to get a dozen eggs, instead you pay $6.16. Sirloin steak. You used to get 1 pound of sirloin steak for 27 cents. Now you got to pay $10. Well, a little bit less, $6.68 for 1 pound. Sugar used to cost about 5 cents for a pound of sugar. Now it's about $1.26 for 1 pound of sugar. William asks, how do you account for the change in the value of the goods you are comparing? In other words, why does sugar go up in value? Why does milk go up in value? Some prices change because production becomes more difficult. If supply chains are affected by any of many factors, then the prices they have to pay to get their supplies change. So they have to change their selling price. The creation of money also changes values. So in other words, there's many reasons. So I keep doing those comparisons for several items: milk, bread, potatoes, and then I come up with this chart to actually test whether the inflation calculator is giving us a good representation of reality. And what I have is the following. I'm comparing prices from 1914 with prices in 2020, almost exactly 106 years later. The price of rice was 9 cents. Had it become 18 cents, we would say that's 100% inflation if this had been 18 cents, but it's not 18 cents, it's 70 cents. So that 70 represents a 752% inflation. If we divide the 752% inflation in terms of how much did the price of rice change on average each individual year, then the number is 1.9%. Half a gallon of milk used to be 18 cents. It's now $3. So the inflation is 1,700% or 2.7% per year. So what I've done is I've listed these goods from the ones that have had the lowest annual inflation to the ones that have the highest annual inflation. So in the process, I find that sugar, for example, has gone up in price far more than rice. Potatoes have gone up in rice far more than sugar or rice. And interestingly, potatoes have gone up in price significantly more than gold. Average inflation in 106 years, according to my calculations for these 8 goods that I've listed here on the left, average annual inflation, 3.5%. The calculator had told us 3%. So I can actually, let me see, I can actually illustrate that. If I go here to online and I write inflation calculator and I choose a calculator right here and I show you 1914 until 2020, how much has $1 changed, which we see right here. There it is, calculate. Inflation has been, let's see, an item that used to cost $1 has gone up to $26. A cumulative rate of inflation, 2,486%. Here it is, 2,487%. That is annual inflation, 3%. So what does this mean? It means that the mechanisms that individuals, such as those working for the Nixon government and those working for the Federal Reserve, the mechanisms that they created in order to stabilize inflation and keep inflation around 3%, those artificial, extraordinary mechanisms, such as creating money out of nothing, have worked. They've worked. It's absolutely incredible, but they've worked. So on the one hand, if you put money under your bed and you wait 100 years, you've lost a lot of money because you cannot buy the same amount of stuff with your money as you could back then. Let me explain one of these numbers. For example, take this one, the price of gold. We're going to explain this number 78, the inflation rate. What exactly does this mean? If the price of gold was $20.67, $20.67 in 1914, And now the price of gold for 1 ounce is more than $1,600. Then what exactly does that mean in terms of the purchasing power of the dollar? What it means is we can divide 1,600 by 20.67, and we find that 20.67 fits inside of 1,600 78 times. What this means is if you could have 1 coin of gold in 1914, and you ask yourself, how much do I have to pay for it? The answer would be $20.67. And now we say, how much gold am I going to get in 2020 if I spend $20.67? How much gold am I going to get? The answer is given by this number. You're going to get 1/78th of the gold that you used to get. In other words, take the coin from 1914, chop it up into 78 little units, 78, and $20 is going to be able to buy you less than one of those 78 units, less than one in 100 years. So this is a disaster. This is the way the US dollar loses its value once it has been unpegged from gold. This is just a disaster. So this is the bad news. The good news is that even though that's a disaster, the relative damage each year is only 3%, which is not just an accident, it is the goal. This is what the Federal Reserve wants. So if every now and then we have inflation of, say, 1.8%, the Federal Reserve is upset. They want it to be a little bit higher. They want it to be 3%. The question is, how do we compare the change in the dollar, which is one change, one thing called inflation, with the change in prices of many goods? The answer is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks thousands of products, say 80,000 products and services, including things such as milk, sugar, movie tickets, gas prices. And those 80,000 products are priced by telephone calls. For example, they might call a supermarket in Cincinnati and ask them, what's your average price on a dozen eggs? And Cincinnati will tell them what it is, and they'll write that down. They'll call another supermarket in Berkeley, California. What is your price, average price on a dozen eggs? They'll give them the answer. All of these prices enable the Bureau of Labor Statistics to come up with the average rate of change, that is the average inflation per item. Suppose it's 3% for one item, 5% for another item, 10% for another item, and then they weigh these items differently and they come up with something known as a consumer price index. Basically, they have this basket of goods that affect our lives, and they come up with if we have all these goods in this basket and they had a certain price in 1970, what price do they have in 1980? And then they call that the overall change, the overall inflation, and then they attribute that to the US dollar. They attribute that overall change of all these items to something that has happened to the dollar, which is the dollar has lost some of its value. For example, the dollar has lost 3% of its value in a 10-year period. It's very impressive because, again, notice how what I did was I just chose 8 items, almost at random, 8 items. And with those 8 items, which are significant items because they range from flour to gold, and I got a number very similar to what an inflation calculator is giving us. To me, that is astonishing. It didn't have to be that way. It could have been, 50% off. It could have been anything. Let me try to go back to. Now, let me show you something really strange. Imagine that you do what I said and you put your money under your bed in 1914. You put your money under your bed and you leave it there. And your house is locked up and nobody gets into your house, and eventually they find that you have some quarters, some so-called Barber quarters from 1914. You know, old quarters are collectibles. They go up in value. How much does the value of an old quarter compare to its purchasing power in 1914? So I looked that up. Here's a quarter in very fine condition. It's very nice condition from 1914, known as a Barber Quarter, meaning a $quarter, 25 cents. You can buy it on eBay, and you can buy many similar ones for similar prices for $36. No shipping costs. Price in 1914 was 25 cents. Price in 2020 is $36. The rate of inflation is 144. That means the inflation for this coin has been 4.7% annually. What this means is if you had kept this exact coin for over 100 years under your bed and you took it to the store to convert it into cash from 2020, you can now buy more with this coin than you could 100 years ago. This is absolutely incredible. This is quite different to anything that, say, David Stockman is describing in his book, The Great Deformation. It's showing you that despite inflation, an actual coin, in many cases, retains its value to purchase what it used to purchase, even if that coin is not necessarily, for example, made of gold or anything. All right, now let's move to the next thing, and then I'll soon be done with this part of my discussion. Pablo, I'm about to break open my piggy bank, see if I have any old coins. Let us know what you find. We'd love to see it. Let's look at inflation a little bit more. Here we have a table that, again, I created in my virtual Microsoft Word Blackboard. Something cost $1 in 1913. Then in 1920, in 1920, exactly, 7 years later, it costs $2. The rate of inflation is plus 102%. In other words, the price has doubled. What I'm showing you in this table is how it changes from one decade to the next. So consider here, we go from 1920 to 1930. $1 in 1920 has a value of 84 cents. That is, it has lost value by 16%, 10 years later. 10 years later, $1 in 1930 again loses 16%. So what this shows you is 1913 to 1920. Here we are witnessing two major events. One is the creation of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve pretends that it's trying to stabilize the government currency. They're trying to stabilize inflation. This is what they claim that they're trying to do. They failed. That's one thing this is showing. They failed. The Federal Reserve failed instantly. They failed instantly in what allegedly they were going to do. The second thing it's showing is this period, 1913 to 1920, that's World War I. So during World War I, again, inflation went up a lot. After World War I, the US dollar starts losing its value, and it keeps losing its value, such that during the Great Depression, the dollar is becoming devalued. It's going down. Things are becoming cheaper, not expensive. They're becoming cheaper. War, namely the Second World War, makes inflation go up again. So now if something used to cost $1 in 1940, it goes to $1.72. If something costs $1, it goes up to $1.72. That's a growth of 72%. So we go the next decade, 1950 to 1960, we have inflation, not as horrifying as the previous decade. 1960 to 1970, we have inflation, again, pretty bad. 1970 to 1980, we have a disastrous inflation. This is what happens after the gold standard is abandoned, meaning this effect of 112 is worse than what happened during World War I and during World War II. Unpegging the dollar from gold actually made things worse. This is really bad as well. Inflation is still disastrous. But now notice that it starts going down. 112, 58%, 31%. Even though it's still growing, the rate of growth is diminishing until we get to the present. If something costs $1 in 2010, then in 2020, it costs $1.19. What this shows you cumulatively is that inflation is diminishing. What it suggests, alongside the price of oil that I showed you at the start of the class, is we are headed towards deflation. Things are going to get cheaper. Oil is going to get cheaper. College education is going to get cheaper. Real estate is going to get cheaper, etc. It's all going to get cheaper. And the question is why? Well, one reason is the coronavirus crisis. You could say, well, that's one reason, but that's a minor reason. The bigger reason is a bubble that I had not mentioned previously in this class until now, which is the credit bubble. Credit means loans. And eventually, if people have endless many loans, they have student loans, car loans, mortgage loans, home equity loans, medical loans. The more loans they have, the less money they have to buy anything. So eventually, if people have no money to buy anything, prices can't go up. They just can't go up because there's no money. So on the one hand, you've got the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve wants inflation to go up. They want prices to go up. If prices go up, then debts become smaller. They're doing everything they can, such as giving money away to try to get prices to go up, but the prices don't go up, they go down. Stores shut down. Chain stores, they shut down. Airlines eliminate flights because people don't have any money. In fact, people lose the habit of buying. People don't go to Sears to buy anything on the weekend. They just don't go. So Sears, JCPenney, all these chain stores just have to shut down. All right, that's it for my part of the lecture. I've spoken for 50 minutes. We still have 18 minutes to chat. Let's talk a little. I'm going to take everybody off of mute, and I'm going to start taking comments and questions, starting with the written ones. Unmuting everybody. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, unmuting. Comments, thoughts, or comments about the readings. We had 2 readings. One I've discussed in a big extent, David Stockman. The other one is by David Graeber. We have not discussed it at all. It's about bullshit jobs. Comments or thoughts, anybody? Let's see. All right, I've unmuted you all, and I'm going to Charles. Charles, can you ask your question, Charles? It's a fascinating mystery. I haven't analyzed this to be able to answer that question because it's so complicated. Think about it this way. There was nothing you could buy, nothing, in 1913 that compared to a cell phone. There was nothing. Then you might have to pay $100 million for anything that would do so many things. You can see someone who is in a different country. You can see them live. You can send a message to someone who is 10,000 miles away. You can read an entire encyclopedia and you can find out the price of oil in less than a second. So there was nothing like that. And now you can buy a cell phone for, say, $50. So that example alone shows how difficult it is to compare the change in lifestyle. Another example is real estate. We go back early enough in American history, you could be a pioneer and you could say, look, I want to have 50 acres of land. And what the government would say is, they'd say, where do you want it? It's free, take it, 50 acres, just go there, put some pebbles around your property and it's yours. Now you've got to pay for it. But it used to be that real estate was so brutally cheap, you could just have it for free. A mortgage in 1933 or something was the equivalent of 3 years of work. That's it. You have a job, meaning you're an employee at a store and you want to buy a house, you get a 3-year mortgage, and at the end of the 3 years, the house is yours. Now you have to indebt yourself and be a slave for 30 years or 40 years. And so Charles, I can't answer that question, and I don't know if anybody has answered it. It's an interesting question to look at. So that's why what I did is I'm only looking at a few items that are consumer prices so that we can begin to think about inflation. But notice how part of what I'm getting at is, what I'm getting at that's surprising, that I didn't know before I did this, was is David Stockman right that there's a major disaster that happened in the economy because of Leo Melamed and Richard Nixon? Or did these characters actually invent something to solve it? I didn't expect to find this. What I find is, boy, these set of tricks that they've put together is sort of working. To do what? To stabilize the currency. Meaning the currency after 1971 has a similar inflation rate to the currency before 1971. That's incredible. It's just absolutely incredible. How have they pulled that off? I do think we're headed towards a big financial disaster anyway, but anyhow, other thoughts or comments? Thank you, Amir. The question is whether David Graeber is right that there are very many bullshit jobs, say nearly 40% in the economy. This is how he gets to it. He says he's an anthropologist. He's the kind of guy who would shoot off his big mouth at parties and sometimes say witty or obnoxious things, and this is one of them. So he wrote an article about it in an obscure journal called Strike. He had never heard about it, but these people published his article, and many other venues start reprinting it. Many people start quoting it. They start sending it to one another and saying, wow, he's right. This is, we're doing a bunch of bullshit jobs. It becomes translated into dozens of languages, and eventually it becomes a book. But originally, what he thought is there are a number of jobs that are being created, such as financial consultants and certain vice presidents of universities and certain managers. Suppose you've got a job and you got a real job, but then there's somebody who manages you. They oversight you and they write forms about what you do. And then somebody has oversight over that person. They write reports and forms about what she does. And we keep adding intermediaries. On the one hand, there's the CEO who owns the company. On the other hand, there's you, you're the worker, maybe you're the Uber driver. But in the middle, there's a ton of people making a lot of money and they're not doing much of anything. Meaning they don't affect how many people are driven here or there to any great extent. He decides to call this a bullshit job because he says a bullshit job is something in which people are self-aware that what they're doing is pointless. They're overpaid. they feel guilty, they feel bad about it, and they even get depressed. The phenomenon certainly exists. What happens is a survey was carried out at some point after his initial article by a website that does survey called YouGov, YOUGOV. And they surveyed, I don't know, a ton of workers. I can't remember the exact number right now. And they found some huge number, somewhere around 35% of respondents said, yeah, I think my job is pointless. And if I didn't do it, it would make no difference. It's at that moment, because of that survey, that Graeber feels or concludes, oh my God, this is a really big part of the economy. Because he thinks, what if we add all the people who are supporting all these bullshit jobs? You know, someone's a secretary for the guy who does the bullshit job. Someone is an assistant for the guy who does a bullshit job. Someone cleans the building for the guy that does a bullshit job. If we include all those people, we're at nearly 40% of the US economy. It's just people doing bullshit jobs. I'll give you an example. A strange example. A couple of nights ago, I was watching this guy from The Walking Dead, Norman Reedus. He has a TV show. He's going on a bike somewhere in Uruguay, and there is a writer with him. And she may well be a good writer, but she writes for several magazines, she explains, and she says that her job consists of basically, she says, pulling things out of her ass and writing them, and those are her articles. In other words, she thinks she's just making shit up. And they get published, and that's her job. And she's on a motorcycle in Uruguay accompanying a TV actor who acts like he's a zombie. Are these essential jobs? I mean, imagine that qualifies and that this is a bullshit job. Your question to me is this guy right, or is he making it up? I can't say anything about the percentage. How many people in the population are doing bullshit jobs? I don't know. I don't know, but I think it's a lot. I think it's a hell of a lot. In the United States, it is one hell of a lot of people who are doing these jobs, and they're depressed because what they're doing is pointless. So it's something sometimes called middle management. Christina says agreed. Someone says middle management. Let me see what Charles said. I'm trying to see if I can get my chat screen to show up. We have, I would argue that now more than ever, entertainment is essential. And Christina says agreed. Yeah, maybe entertainment is essential. I think entertainment on the whole is a good thing. But the point is there such a thing? And this guy's an anthropologist. He works on economics, and he thinks that there's something wrong going on in the United States. Think about it this way. Imagine that you got a corporation and it brings in $10 million in profits, and you've already paid everyone. You've paid all your workers. One possibility is you take that money for yourself. You're the CEO, so you take it in as profits. Another possibility is you give it to the workers at the bottom of the pyramid. They drive the Uber, why not double their salary? Just give it to them. That's another possibility, but Americans generally, the people who are CEOs generally don't like duplicating people at the bottom of their salaries. So instead what they do is they say, well, I'm gonna hire a bunch of consultants that are gonna work with me, and they're gonna be creative consultants that are gonna tell me issues that we should all work on. And they're gonna write reports, and I'm gonna call them vice president of this and vice president of that, senior executive officer of management strategies. And they start spending gobs and gobs of this money on new hires. And the new hires get the money and they start putzing around, trying to figure out what to do. They've got a budget and they're kind of making up their own job. So to what's his face, Dave Graeber, these are bullshit jobs. Comments or thoughts on this? Let me try to unmute all of you. We're running out of time here very quickly. Anyone else? Thoughts, comments? And the interesting thing is that he makes a ton of money and a ton of fame by making this kind of claim. In other words, it's not that he's saying your job is bullshit and my job is bullshit. He's saying that there's a big sector of the population that says their own job is bullshit. He's saying, I'm going to take them seriously. They don't want to do their job. They're depressed. They want to do something else. They don't want to go to work. I'm going to take them seriously. So there is the money to pay them, but instead we've told them, you are the senior vice president for operations, management, research. And now the guy starts writing reports about what's going on in the corporation, and he feels, you know, it's kind of some bullshit just to be hired. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I received emails and a phone call from a team of lawyers that wanted me to be a consultant in a lawsuit. Some people had died in an explosion in a gas pipe. And somehow these team of lawyers, high-profile lawyers, they found my name, and they thought, since I had written an unusual book about mathematics, they wanted me to analyze the case of the explosion and make up an argument. And when the guy's talking with me on the phone, he honestly said, well, you know, I just want you to put together some bullshit so we can convince the judge that the pipe did not really explode because of ABC. So consciously, they wanted to hire me to sell some bullshit to a judge, and I turned it down. So I don't think most jobs that this guy is referring to have that nature where somebody hires you to say, look, I just need you to do some bullshit to get things settled. But what he's trying to get us to think about is, if we have so many people who are paid a lot of money, but they don't want to do their job, how about we keep paying them that money, or we pay them some money, and we tell them, you can do whatever you want. Just do what you want. So he's arguing for this universal basic income, the kind of thing that Andrew Yang proposed during the elections, and for which he was roundly ridiculed by many Republicans. But now suddenly, what are people getting on the mail? They're getting a bunch of checks. Checks, you don't even have to work. The check is coming. In Spain, they're talking about giving universal basic income to people without working in these months of the coronavirus, and maybe permanently. Let's just give money to people. And the argument becomes, maybe the dream or the hope, if you give people freedom and you give them money, they're going to do something better than the official job that they're supposed to be doing 9 to 5, that is depressing them and makes them feel that, you know, secretly what they're doing is just a big waste of time. So don't think about it as here's a guy who's trying to insult us, saying that our job is bullshit. He's a guy who sees himself as representing people who say that their job is bullshit and who want to do something else and who want to get out of it. And he's trying to come up with an alternative. Final thought, anyone, before I disconnect?
I typed what I had to say mostly, but
say it.
I think that right now shows that, like, what's actually a bullshit job and what is essential, and how great the disparity is in what essential workers are getting paid right now and what people who are, like, not really doing anything and are still getting paid a lot of money to not do that much, and how much we, like, don't value people who are essential to our lifestyle. But also, I think that what the article was about kind of comes full circle in that sort of, like, you know how you always say, like, things are broken, and like, people are just doing things and wasting their time in things that don't matter and, like, aren't making a difference and, like, aren't making an impact at all. And if people actually, like, put their time into thinking for, like, a second, maybe we could make a lot of improvements that are just not being made because of the way that our economy is set up.
I agree. I mean, I do think there's something of value here, which is, like you, when I read Graeber's article, and he's written many other things about the same topic, and he's given many talks about this topic. But when I read this particular article in The Economist, I was thinking about these so-called essential workers in the economy today. It's almost as though the reality, the community wakes up and realizes, oh my God, nobody can go to work. And then they say, well, actually not nobody. The essential workers have to keep going. The people who make food, the people who drive trucks, the people who operate pharmacies, the people who operate hospitals, they have to keep going to work. The people who work at airplanes, at airlines, they have to work. But all these financial consultants and investment managers and what are they called? Senior vice presidents and junior vice presidents and middle management types, they don't have to go to work. You know, you just stay at home, don't do anything, get out of the way while we try to save the economy. And you got the big irony that the essential workers are the ones that are lowest paid. So it's a wonderful phrase that came up at this moment to actually call them essential workers and realize, boy, these are the workers that keep things going. So I think Graeber sympathizes a lot with that kind of worker and is annoyed. He's annoyed by the irony that people who do a lot of non-essential things, he thinks, are both existentially depressed about what they're doing, and they're getting paid much more money than the essential workers. Mariana asked the question to everyone, is the financial sector that causes the inverse relationship, or what is the cause? Oh, there's an inverse relationship about how much someone's work affects other and their pay. I don't think it's just the financial sector that causes the inverse relationship. I think society has different priorities. So there's a bias for hundreds of years against people who work with their hands. If you work with your hands, for example, cleaning or laboring in a field or constructing things, than people who don't work with their hands, who just sit with a suit in a desk in an air-conditioned environment and write things. This is a bias that is hundreds of years old, and it's a big problem, but it wasn't even invented in the US. It's a cultural problem. Everyone, I'm out of time. We have to hang up. If anybody wants to stay and ask me an individual question, you're welcome. But if not, please hang up. And if you all don't hang up, eventually I'll hang up. Take care, and thank you for showing up. Bye-bye.